Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luke Georgiou from the University of Manchester, and I have the privilege to chair the steering committee of the EUA Council for Doctoral Education. Welcome to our annual meeting for 2021. Our theme is Preparing Doctoral Education for a Post-Pandemic World. There is a certain irony that with this title, we still find ourselves meeting in the virtual world, and I only wish I could say the words post-pandemic with more confidence. Nonetheless, across our members, we are seeing hopeful signs that vaccination and some continuing precautions are opening up opportunities for us to return to the world of face-to-face interaction. Like many of you, I expect in recent days, I attended my first large-scale meeting, in this case, the national equivalent of the EUA, Universities UK's annual conference, and experienced the pleasure of meeting colleagues who had only been faces in Zoom and Teams and other platforms for 18 months at least. As we will be discussing in our first plenary panel in a few minutes, the resumption of networking is a bigger hurdle for our doctoral early career researchers who have not had the possibility of drawing upon past social capital to build the networks that are so important for research and for the foundation of an academic career. To meet internationally is a step further and one that we hope to take very soon, but we should also remember that this is a global pandemic which can only be said to be under control when this applies to all parts of the world, north and south. It is fitting then that we have this year what I hope and expect will be our most global annual meeting in terms of the speakers and the topics on global challenges that we shall address, notably the quest for sustainability. Sharing experience has always been a core part of our raison d'être, and we hope that the added scope of experience this wider sharing brings will be of benefit to all of us. Of course, we will also be covering the immediate pressing concerns that we face in delivering the highest possible quality of doctoral education, including plenaries on the role of academic freedom for doctoral researchers, the challenge of equipping our candidates with the skills they need in the ever more complex and dynamic labour market that they will enter, and what it takes to make a success of collaboration between institutions in doctoral education. All of these topics will be informed by two key inputs. We have in this meeting the first public presentation and discussion of key results of the 2021 EUA CDE survey on current developments in doctoral education. And let me thank you for responding to this. And also we have the vision of the future that the EUA has brought together from its members, Universities Without Walls. Our strength as an association has always rested in what our members bring, and as ever, we have a rich menu of parallel sessions that offer the detailed experiences of our colleagues for you to explore and to challenge. The platform we are using makes it easier to have one-to-one conversations and to try to reproduce the coffee time moments that we miss so much. Please do take advantage of these, and also to drop in on the CDE itself, the CDE booth, if you have any points you'd like to discuss. I will shortly be back to introduce and moderate our first plenary session, but before that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Amanda Crowfoot, Secretary General of the European University Association, to add her own welcome. Amanda, please.
Thank you very much, Luke, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you and to welcome you on behalf of EUA to the EUA CDE Annual Meeting 2021. We actually have over 350 delegates registered for this event, which is excellent. And we're so thrilled and delighted to have so many people interested and joining us in the next few days. I'm also really delighted to see the doctoral education community coming together at this moment to discuss some of the big issues in doctoral education, despite the challenging circumstances that we continue to find ourselves in, as Luke has already alluded to. The Council for Doctoral Education is a really important part of the European University Association. And essentially, it's something that allows us to engage with and learn from and provide support for the doctoral education community and early career researchers across Europe. It's very much taken into account in our portfolio of different activities, in our strategic planning, and in our vision for the future. As many of you will probably know, and as Luke has also mentioned briefly, this year EUA published Universities Without Walls, which is our vision as the university sector for universities in 2030. So essentially, we set out in this document a vision for universities of the future that are open, transformative, and transnational, that are sustainable, that are diverse and engaged, and that are strong and autonomous and accountable. This document is intended to provide inspiration for those who make strategic decisions and those who are involved in planning at universities across Europe, such as yourselves. So I'm hoping there are things in the document that will provide you with exactly that, with inspiration for your own activities and your own planning. I'm very pleased to say that my colleague Thomas Jorgensen will actually deliver a keynote address on Wednesday morning about Universities Without Walls. So we'll give you an opportunity to hear more about it and to engage with that. And I hope you do find that useful. I think it's fair to say that we're at a very interesting time, an interesting and important moment in terms of universities and higher education. I think for much of the last 18 months, COVID has really forced us to think about the present. It's forced us to grapple, often very urgently, with everyday problems. So essentially, we've been thinking about the today and possibly the tomorrow, but not the long term. And I think now we're really at a stage where we have an opportunity to think beyond this and start thinking about the future and really where we go from here in terms of a sector and in terms of the various topics that we engage with, including doctoral education. I'm hoping this meeting can provide inspiration for you all, both in terms of that big picture and those future developments, and also the practicalities and the realities of doctoral education, which continue to obviously be relevant and hugely important. I'd also like to take a moment to emphasize the importance of having a global conversation and not just a European one. I think it's fair to say that all of the challenges of the day, be it COVID or climate change or the increase in misinformation or disruption of labour markets due to artificial intelligence, anything we can think of is effectively global. And also many of the key issues that happen at institutional level around how to support doctoral candidates in their academic careers, they apply across borders. So it makes no sense to talk about them in isolation. EUA CDE has a very important role in terms of being the voice of European universities in global discussions. And so I'm very pleased that we have today here with us our global partners to discuss the impact of COVID on doctoral education. And of course, we can't lose sight of the fact that global exchange is a crucial part of higher education at every level, even if, we have had to alter how we exchange and how we collaborate in the last 18 months. So I don't want to take too much time because we have a packed agenda and lots of excellent speakers to hear from this afternoon. So I'd just like to finish by echoing Luke's sentiments that it's such a shame we're not able yet to do this face-to-face and see you all in person. We do hope to be able to resume in-person events next year. And in the meantime, we have tried to make this event as much like a physical conference as we possibly can in the virtual environment. So please do take the opportunities presented for the networking as well as for the participation in the various different plenary and parallel discussions. So finally, I'd just like to say that I'm looking forward personally very much to a lively 3 days and lots of inspiring ideas. And I wish you all an excellent annual meeting. And with that, I'll hand back to Luke.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We're now ready to proceed with our first plenary session. If we can just bring up the opening title slide for that. Thank you very much. So this session is on the global effects of COVID-19 on doctoral education. As Amanda has just stressed, the pandemic is by definition global, and by inviting colleagues from 4 continents, we hope to be able to cast some light on the similarities and differences in our situations, and also to broaden the scope of the mutual learning which defines the CDE. Just to set a little bit of context for the session, these are some of the issues in which doctoral education has been affected by the pandemic. The first of these is digitalization. We all know by now the advantages and disadvantages that this has brought. I won't enumerate them in detail, but very broadly speaking, doctoral researchers and those who are supporting them have achieved some gains in accessibility, but on the other hand, we have seen a loss of peer learning and exchange, and some of that important tacit knowledge acquisition. A second dimension of impacts has been in the realm of funding. We have a cohort of candidates, many of whom have experienced disruption to the timing of their research, which may have meant they have gone out of synchronicity between their funding support and the time in which they have to carry out the research. Many extensions have been arranged, but it's nonetheless left individuals with challenges. Some of them have also had other financial pressures, for example, the loss of part-time earning opportunities, and also increased concerns about their potential future employment. Internationalization is, of course, a global topic in itself, and we'll be hearing a lot more about this during the session, but clearly the impact has been great upon any activity which previously involved going across borders. I think paradoxically, we've seen a growing recognition of the importance of international partnerships during this period of the pandemic, and perhaps we'll return to that in the discussion. Last but certainly not least, a problem that was already growing in importance before the pandemic has been made more acute. The issue of welfare in general and well-being, including the mental health of both candidates and of staff. And I think it's fair to say that there have been particular pressures for international students who have been isolated in many ways from their friends, family, and other supporters. So we will, in the discussions, be asking to what extent these themes are constant across the different systems represented in the meeting today. Probably quite a few of you have attended meetings discussing the impact of COVID on doctoral education and how we can provide the best possible such education within those constraints. But the time has come now to shift our focus a little bit and ask what we can learn and take forward from this after the pandemic, echoing the forward-looking sentiments that Amanda previously expressed. And remembering also that none of the challenges that we faced before the pandemic have really gone away. And I expect we'll be hearing something of those as well. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. I will quickly run through who the members of it are and then introduce them individually as we come to their presentations. And after that, we would be very grateful if you can give us some questions and points that we can bring into the discussion. So on our panel today, we have from Australia, Alistair McEwen, who is the convener of the Australian Council of Graduate Research and is a Pro-Vice Chancellor and Acting Dean at the University of Queensland. He will be followed by Ernest Ariete, Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance, ARUA, who's former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana. Our third panelist is Maria Luz Vilches, Vice President for the Loyola School, Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Now, you may have seen in the program that we had a fourth panelist from Chile, Alicia Salomone. Unfortunately, for personal reasons, she's had to withdraw at the last minute, but with great flexibility and generosity, we've been able to cross the Andes, and our fourth panelist now will be Luciano Noceto, who is Undersecretary of Higher Studies for Doctorate at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. So I very much look forward to hearing all of them, but let me begin by asking Alistair to open our panel discussion.
Thank you, Luke. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, well, great pleasure for me to be giving this first presentation. As you can see from my background, it's we're heading into the night in Brisbane, Australia, about 10 to 10 in the evening. But as I say, I'm really pleased to be here. And what I'm going to do is spend about the next 10 minutes or so talking about the effects of COVID-19 on doctoral education in Australia. And some of this is coloured by my perspective, of course, of being at the University of Queensland, where I was Dean until a few weeks ago. Now I'm doing the research and development there. So what I'm going to do really is walk you through some of the effects that COVID has had and in exposing, I think, some weaknesses in our approach in Australia to supporting its universities, and in particular graduate education, and the double-edged effects, I think, of the international borders being closed for the last 18 months or so in Australia. And I'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about the future, because I'm not certain about what that's going to look like, but it is the question of snapback versus a new vision for doctoral education. So just a bit of background on the Australian scene. We have almost 70,000 what we call high degree by research students within Australia, HDR students, and about 90% of them are PhD candidates. Only about 10% are research masters. As you can see on the bar diagram on on the right-hand side, there's been a considerable increase in the proportion of international students who are undertaking a high degree bioresearch in Australia, and they constitute just about under 40%, around 36% of our graduates now are from international countries. So it's a very, very diverse population in Australia. So just a bit of background on the way we fund students within Australia, our system. Our system's funded by the federal, the Commonwealth government, and that supports doctoral education via the research training program. Our candidates are students in Australia, so they paid a tax-free scholarship and their tuition is paid as well. But the challenge for us with international HDR students is that there's a 10% cap on this expenditure by the government. So we have to use discretionary income to provide additional scholarships for international students. And that's started to put quite a bit of pressure on universities, of course, because there's been a reduced international fee income over the last 2 years. And this has certainly been exacerbated by some other switches that have happened in Commonwealth block grant funding. So this is a double hit on discretionary income, and it certainly challenges universities to think in the future how much they value doctoral education, and particularly how much they value international doctoral education. So that's an ongoing challenge. If I then look at the effect of the border closures, I think many of you will know that Australia closed its international borders in March 2020. And the country actually enjoyed, I think, essentially a COVID-free period from July 2020 to July 21, with the notable exception of Victoria, where Melbourne had a serious lockdown last year. But as you have also experienced, I think, many doctoral candidates found it extremely difficult to progress. Disruption due to restricted travel, carers' responsibilities, homeschooling, and people who work in areas such as health science research, where human contact is required, or do field work, and that spreads across, and the social sciences, found it very difficult to progress. Our international student travel was, of course, extremely severely restricted, and so new students could not commence. And some universities have commenced students overseas, and we've been more cautious at the University of Queensland about this because there are potential adverse effects on progression. We don't think the borders will fully reopen until mid-2022, and there's an ongoing challenge of managing remote doctoral students, and currently there are lockdowns in Sydney and Melbourne, so we're not through this just yet. So there's still many challenges going ahead, and I think this connects then to this financial stress that universities are undertaking at the moment. And I think a pessimist would say that doctoral candidate enrollments may decrease over the next few years. Just to say something about the government settings as well, I think that there's an ongoing challenge of supporting research in Australia, but the government has really focused heavily on what they term translation and commercialization, and they're promoting strongly industry internships. The concern I think that we should have is that this is very much aligned with a skills development and work integrated learning. And so in my view, this skills and training agenda to some extent lacks ambition. And I think there's a concern that it fails perhaps to recognize the value of graduate researchers, of doctoral education in terms of the knowledge economy. And I think there is a bit of a threat to basic research. Rather, I would like to see an investment in research and researchers. And so I think what we need to develop is a broader investment model. And I just want to turn now and try and think a little bit about what the value proposition, for want of a better word, is in this context. Before I do so, I'll just say something about international doctoral students and why they're so important. One is that we certainly need doctoral students to participate in research. We don't have sufficient domestic students to fit Australia's research capacity. But also doctoral education is incredibly important in relation to Australia's place in the world, and our engagement with India, Indonesia, and Vietnam is extremely important. So our place in South Asia is really incredibly important. It's likely that we'll see a decrease and perhaps some degree of decoupling from China, but that might help us in terms of the diversification of our student body in that context. And finally, I think we do need very strong links with Europe and North America, and certainly across all areas, but certainly in science and technology. So just turning to what the ways in which we might respond going forward in terms of post-COVID. One of the things I think we need to continue to think about is aligning our doctoral programs with the aspirations of doctoral candidates. I think there's an antidote to the skills and training agenda is to really think carefully about what the qualities of our graduate researchers actually are, and very much looking at the transferable skills that they have and not just their research outputs. And I think we need to link this to the investment in innovation to the employment of doctoral graduates. And I'll finish by just saying about collaborative models, which I think we need to look at. So just to start with the aligning doctoral programs, we really need to remind ourselves that about the aspirations of doctoral candidates. And maybe in some parts of the world, this is already a given, but certainly an assessment of what Australian PhDs want to do post in the future. Majority actually want to work outside of academia. And this is a survey done by the National Science Agency, CSIRO, and the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute. And you can see that more than half of students want to work in either the private sector, government, startups, and other areas. And so I think one of the starting points, I think, will be to ensure that our PhD advisors understand that, and we need to equip them better to help the students, I guess, fulfill these interesting ambitions that they have. The other thing is to connect with industry, and I think, or with business, and get end users in a broader sense to understand the value of doctoral graduates. This relates to quite a big project that's been going on in Australia called PostAc, which stands for Post Academia, and it's been run by Inga Mewburn from the Australian National University, and some of you may know Inga by her other name, which is the Thesis Whisperer. What Inga did was a project which looked at job ads for across a variety of sectors and looked at the attributes and the qualities that they were asking for, omitting the term PhD in terms of the search that she did. Then she aligned that with the attributes that we claim our doctoral candidates ought to have. From this, she can construct an alignment of the degree of research intensity that business is looking for. And through this study, what she's found is, in principle, there are huge numbers of jobs where PhD graduates would really meet what industry, in its broadest sense, is looking for. And I think it's quite an interesting and exciting study, but what's required, I think, is to open the minds of employers to understand what a graduate researcher can do for a business. Perhaps that's already given in some parts of Europe, but certainly it isn't in Australia. And what she really finds is there's a variety, the transferable skills are really the core of the doctoral degree value proposition in this context. This is what's going to sustain them in the long term, obviously alongside that disciplinary capability that they also develop. So what I think we see in the future, and as a sort of as a more expansive vision, is doctoral education really in Australia really leading to drive, I think, an innovation agenda. But what we certainly need is much more investment to pull through postdoctoral researchers to develop their careers. So this is not a totally new theme, but it's certainly one I think that that should resonate in the future, rather than this rather narrow, I think, skills and training agenda. So I only have one slide at the end, which really addresses the question of where we're heading. I think in terms of I think there is a potential, I think, to start to think about different ways in which we can look at doctoral education. There's a lot of interest, I think, in mission-oriented research, and many people talk about the SDGs and other things. These are require big, complex programmatic approaches, and it's questionable whether an individualized doctoral degree actually is appropriate in some ways in terms of participation in such mission-oriented research. I think so. One of the things I think we should be thinking about is, can we develop further doctoral education programs where the doctoral candidates develop the capabilities that will enable them to start to participate in such large-scale collaborative projects later in their careers. So I think we need to lay the groundwork for that. And this hyper-individualized doctoral degree, which often occurs, may not be the best way in which to prepare students for this longer-term careers that they will have. I think links to that is the pressure with regard to outputs. I think one of the challenges is that although doctoral candidates are students, they also are seen as being part of the research workforce very often. That puts a lot of pressure on doctoral candidates. And Luke mentioned mental health and well-being. That's one of the really critical factors. So I think one of the things we need to think about carefully is, what ways can we value contributions in a doctoral thesis rather than just the outputs? I think that's already been done in some areas, but I think we could think more carefully about that. And finally, I think one of the things that we think about in Australia, of course, is that we are very geographically isolated. And there was a time when we could jump on a plane and visit places, and hopefully we will do that again. But I think what this has shown is, of course, that virtual networks are very powerful. And I think that building these collaborative tools to foster international collaboration is clearly going to be something that's very important, and certainly very important for Australia. And I think it could be linked to this first area, which is about developing these collaborative capabilities that our students would really, I think, really wish for, I think, because my feeling is that they are looking for bigger, more purposeful collaborations during their doctoral candidature. So I'll stop now and thank you all for listening, and looking forward to participating in the questions. Thank you.
Luke, you're muted. Luke, sorry, we can't hear you. You're muted. So you need to put your sound on. Yes.
Sorry, I gather my sound wasn't on. So
yes.
I was thanking Alistair and also saying that it's now my pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Ernest Arite, who will give us a perspective from Africa. Ernest, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luke. So I talked briefly about how the pandemic has affected African universities in terms of their capacity to deliver doctoral education. The main message I have is basically that even before the pandemic, Africa had the lowest research or capacity output, and most of it is skewed towards males and then non-science disciplines. So it's the baseline from which we beginning is not great. The pandemic has affected teaching and learning. It's affected access to resources and also capacity to do research, including design, workload and funding, and then admissions, examinations, graduation. All of these have been affected. There's some effort to improve infrastructure. For example, the introduction of virtual laboratory platforms, and then continued funding is critical to enhancing doctoral education post-COVID. So these are the three main messages that I seek to bring in this presentation. In doing this, I highlight the state of doctoral education in Africa before the pandemic, and I use the university of the network, the African Research Universities Alliance. There are 16 members, and I use them, 13 of them as examples for the point that I make. I discuss the main areas of doctoral education that have been affected the most by the pandemic, and then I discuss arrangements that universities have put in place to deal with the challenges that have come with the pandemic. So, in talking about the state of doctoral education, I make the first point that enrollments are generally low, and these are dominated by males. So the likelihood of finding female doctoral students in African universities is fairly low. Most women that you find doing doctoral programs will be in South Africa. There's places like Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, Pretoria, and they are likely to have more females in their programs than in the other African universities. The distribution is very across the disciplines. As I said earlier, most programs are in the social sciences, and many of the universities within our network seek to change that. Indeed, there's evidence that many of them have begun the process of change, trying to strengthen STEM education at the doctoral level. This chart basically shows how doctoral graduates constitute a smaller share of all the graduates. Effectively, many of the people that are enrolled in postgraduate programs are doing a master's, a research master's, or something else. The number of people doing doctoral programs is very small. So Ibadan University, for example, has the largest number of postgraduate students, but the proportion that are doing doctorate programs far less than 3%. And that runs across the entire spectrum. So you see that even the South African universities that have the most sophisticated graduate programs also tend to have small numbers doing doctorate. Now, one of the things that we've struggled with in the region is to ensure that doctorate programs do not take too long. We've been struggling to get them to try and finish programs between 4 and 5 years, sometimes 6 years. Many universities have different types of programs. There are some, especially the South African, that have PhD programs going for 3 years, largely based on research. And then you have some that in other African countries that have 4-year programs that include research and also teaching. And then you have some that do 5-year programs. There are even some universities that may have 3-year programs, 4-year programs, 5-year programs, depending on discipline. That's one of the things that we seek to change among the African universities, try to bring some uniformity in what they do. In this chart here, we're talking about postdoctoral research fellowships. It's seen as one of the biggest incentives for getting young people doing their PhDs to want to get into academic environments. There is very little opportunity in many universities for doing that. In this chart, we see that the South African universities, Pretoria, Wits, Stellenbosch, UCT, KwaZulu-Natal, have a much larger opportunity for their students than do you find in a place like Makerere. Many of the other African universities do not have any, or are not reporting any postdoctoral opportunities at all. And that's something that, of course, needs to change. How has COVID-19 affected the education programs? We first talk about teaching, learning, and access to resources. What is interesting is that when the pandemic broke, many of the universities resorted to using various virtual platforms for engaging with students. And the platform is quite different from place to place. At University of Ghana, they use Sakai. In Pretoria, they have the ClickUp. Sheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, they used Microsoft Teams, which has been the facility that many universities have used. Zoom is also very popular in a number of universities. We make mention of the fact that a transition to an adoption of virtual platforms for teaching has not gone without any problems. There have been huge challenges. And we find that those universities that before the pandemic had begun building the platforms, using them for distance education, were much better prepared than those that did not have any such arrangement in place. What we've seen as a result of this is that the huge divide between the digital divide between African countries and the global north has been further accentuated by the current situation. During the lockdown, doctoral students, especially in science programs that require presence at laboratories, were the most affected. Many of the lab programs could not take place and had to be delayed or cancelled, which affected graduation for many of these students. Limited access to some library resources remains a challenge for many in the universities in Africa. What this chart is basically from a study conducted by the Mawazo Institute in Kenya, basically showing where programs were suspended and where they were not suspended. We see that the suspension of programs was quite pronounced in West Africa, much more so than in East Africa or in Southern Africa, in other places also. It's also in West Africa that you found the least number of things not being suspended. So clearly, what this chart shows is that throughout the region, the suspension of field work, the suspension of lab-based work has been quite pronounced, and that's something that needs to be remedied in the coming years. Institutions offering electronic means of learning, what this chart shows the variation across the different different parts of the region. In East Africa, we see what the situation was compared to West Africa. West Africa had the least opportunity for offering e-learning. Basically, in West Africa, many of the universities had not invested adequately in the platforms, the facilities that will make this possible, and so they suffered much more than in other parts of the region. So how has COVID-19 affected the doctoral education in terms of research, the design, funding, and workload, and so on? Field work that required physical presence was suspended. There were a number of projects in many different countries that required students to spend a lot of time in the field. During the lockdown, they couldn't travel. And even when lockdown was lifted, in many places, physical engagement with households was limited, largely in view of difficulties in getting people to actually respond to interviews and so on. Grant applications for field work were very much suspended. Many of the universities did not have the means to support work in the field. Sometimes also international grants were suspended. And I give the example of the UK government cutting aid from 0.7% of GNI to 0.5%. That affected, to a very large extent, the development research work being done in the region. Many of the Arua universities found their grants going down by more than 50%. And that's something that we need to be worried about. We talk about the need to ensure that the capacity to do work is not affected adversely by these funding cuts. It's something that we are working on. We're encouraging many more African governments to step in, do what could have been done only by international assistance. So get African governments working in this area is one of the 8 things that we are pushing for very, very strongly as a network. One of the things that we saw also with the pandemic is admissions, examinations, graduation being affected. Of course, many of the universities who resorted to using virtual means for their students to graduate, a number of graduation events were cancelled. We also saw the extension of time for the completion of programs in many, many places. So even though we've been targeting 4 years on the average for the completion of doctorate programs, we've seen a gradual shift to about 5 years in a number of universities, which is problematic for the students and also for the university themselves in view of the cost of these extensions. Universities have made plans for dealing with this. In many places, the challenge is the infrastructure. The challenge is the infrastructure to deliver virtual programs, the infrastructure to allow students to be properly tested regularly, the infrastructure to allow tracking to take place, and so on. These are things that make it difficult for university to support doctoral work. The candidates are often very much in the state of confusion, not knowing what the universities are going to do, and it's something that we need to deal with as soon as possible. There have been opportunities for enhancing graduate work at the doctoral level. What the pandemic has allowed us to experience and benefit from is the use of virtual platforms. Our universities in this position to invest more and more in these. That's what we are pushing for. Continued funding is important. As I said earlier, we are pushing African governments to do a lot more than they've done in the past. Research collaborations that require very inclusive partnerships for us is the way forward. We are working a lot with the European universities. We are working a lot with the UK universities in this area. And we do expect that through these collaborations, some of the disadvantages that we've suffered in the past year will be taken care of. So these effectively lead us to our conclusion that African higher education institutions are beginning to evolve beyond their traditional expected roles and need to be supported. Enhancing doctoral training is critical to sustaining it. We believe strongly in that, and we believe that through partnerships, we can achieve a lot of this. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions that will follow.
Thank you very much indeed, Ernest. Many insights there. Could I just echo your last remark and encourage those in our audience to post some questions, both to individual members of the panel and even better ones that we can build a discussion around. You don't have to wait to the end. Start accumulating some. So let me move on now to introduce our third panelist. It's my pleasure again to introduce Maria Vilches, who will give us a perspective from the Philippines and perhaps wider Asian perspective also. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you very much. Greetings from a good evening from my place here, but it's good morning for others and good afternoon as well. In Philippine universities, doctoral education is geared towards building the capacity of academic staff in higher education institutions. The drive comes from external bodies, both local and international, that measure quality assurance, counting the PhDs as a gauge of expertise in the fields of study offered by these institutions. Most doctoral students in the Philippines are teachers. Only a few end up working solely in labs or in the industry. The majority are part-time students who are also teaching on the side. Resources for doctoral education are dire, hence this compromise agreement. Only the Department of Science and Technology and the Commission for Higher Education have consistent but limited scholarship support. Even that requires counter-funding from universities. As part of its service to the nation, Ateneo de Manila gives 50% tuition fee discount to any teacher doing postgraduate study in the university. This presentation offers some observations of the state of doctoral education in the Philippines in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Observations based on the experiences of 4 Manila-based universities. I look at challenges or humps on the road and opportunities of going over the humps using examples, particular examples from Ateneo de Manila University. I end with a note of hope. When the pandemic storm struck, the education landscape got sorely distorted. All academic institutions were forced to transition to an online setting for their operations. Ateneo Blue Cloud became Ateneo de Manila's platform for online education. The first item on the agenda for many universities was to choose a learning management system that was available, viable, and affordable for cash-strapped institutions that could not increase tuition fees in the face of an economic downturn. The past year was cruel, but most have survived. Up to now, all academic institutions in the Philippines continue to operate remotely online. Students have gone back to their original residences in the archipelago of more than 7,600 islands. In our empty and lonely campuses, rare birds and other creeping creatures come to prance around joyfully and claim the green and lush surroundings. One big consistent challenge in this online setting is the unstable internet connectivity or lack of it, especially in some remote parts of the country. Worse, during inclement weather conditions of flooding and strong winds that cut off power supply and render electronic gadgets inept. Without the computer labs that they were used to, now students had to purchase their own laptops. That wasn't easy for most. Meantime, mobiles came in handy in connecting to their professors and classes. In Ateneo de Manila, we provided internet subsidy to scholars and also lent them laptops. The entire online learning system in itself has been a huge adjustment. It has revolutionized the home front, where family life has been invaded by the academic demands of a doctoral study. The libraries are closed, so the usual hideaway for quiet space is non-existent. Doctoral students in the physical sciences have been most affected by the lockdowns. Some have taken a leave of absence in the meantime, waiting for when they are allowed to go back to the labs. Like most everyone else, doctoral students miss the social interaction in face-to-face study groups, classroom discussions, and conferences where they can freely network with other scholars. Cabin fever, as well as news of virus infection and deaths, have caused anxiety and other mental health problems. a condition that has slowed down research and interest in the study, detrimental especially to those under time-bound scholarship contracts. For some, loss of jobs has aggravated the situation. All this negative picture is not the end of story, thankfully. Those who have adjusted better have come to like the idea of remote learning, actually, especially if they want to stay close to their families. Even those who have lost their jobs but who have access to other resources have inquired about PhD programs online. Since there's nothing much to do, might as well make use of time productively. Mentors have a great role to play in encouraging the research students, checking in on them to sustain interest and boost their morale. A physics professor steadfastly guides researchers in using data for modeling, allowing them to perform their experiments in the labs or through remote access to computer facilities. Doctoral students in chemistry are also able to report to the labs individually, as carefully arranged by their inspiring professor who continues to work in the Philippine Institute of Pure and Applied Chemistry. One good thing about this online setting is that universities have been able to tap their network among scholars and professors from overseas who can now do lectures and research advisement for the doctoral students. When teaching and learning was predominantly on-site, it was difficult to get academics to spend a semester in another place across the globe. Not anymore, when travel arrangements are no longer a concern. Being taught by renowned academics in the fields, though online, has inspired doctoral students to do well and even submit papers to journals where these experts also happen to be editors. Our Indonesian PhD student in economics, for example, is thinking of co-writing a few articles on international trade with colleagues from overseas. When virtual conferences may be regarded as poor substitutes for face-to-face on-site conferences, some have been successfully organized, in fact. Early this year, Ateneo de Manila co-hosted with the Universidad Nova de Lisboa a month-long conference to commemorate 500 years of Asian-Iberian encounters. Lots of scholars, doctoral students included, from different parts of the world, delivered interesting presentations. While doctoral education in the Philippines may have slowed down owing to conditions brought about by the pandemic, this time has also allowed others to finish their degree, a light to counter the darkness of this pandemic. Ateneo de Manila has a continuing PhD dual supervision program with La Trobe University, and our 6 faculty members in that program are on track. And so are our students at the Nara Institute of Technology in Japan. Notices of scholarships for doctoral studies abroad continue to come our way from funding institutions with whom we have established good relationships. In times of adversity, a robust student support system is necessary. Ateneo de Manila has upgraded its mental health protocols to cover a wide range of services for its students. Academic support is provided by the library with its online e-books and databases, as well as help desk facility. If students need a copy of a chapter in a physical book, the library is able to digitize it and send it to the students. Another support is creating opportunities where students recognize their achievements. In Ateneo de Manila, Doctoral Students Graduate Research Festival allows them to get feedback on their work from fellow students and their professors. Their publications are also uploaded in Archium Ateneo, which exposes their work to a wider audience of scholars. A third support is the continuous research done by professors, especially research that addresses societal concerns like COVID-19. Some have been published in high-impact journals, others have been presented in university fora. The interdisciplinary Coastal Cities at Risk research team is headed by a sociology professor. The resilience projects are spearheaded by a psychology professor. The research on virgin coconut oil against COVID-19 is championed by a chemistry professor. The COVID-19 Tracker project is the brainchild of a professor at the Department of Information Systems and Computer Science. These and other research projects have inspired doctoral students, whether or not they are part of the research team. In conclusion, while doctoral education in the Philippines is struggling during this pandemic, universities are trying their best to lift the morale of students through creative ways of engaging them so that they will not lose steam. Students collaborate with their professors in research undertakings that have been found inspiring and encouraging. What I see is that scholars in the universities are key to making doctoral education survive, thrive, and flourish even in this pandemic situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and also for finishing on an optimistic note as well. So as our time is pressing, I would like to move on to our final panelist contribution in this session, which comes from Luciano Nosetto. Luciano, please.
Good morning from Buenos Aires. It's 9 a.m. here. I'm glad to be speaking after this hopeful message from our colleague from Manila. I will show a presentation in a minute. I will speak from the personal experience, my personal professional experience as a head of the doctoral program in social sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. Let me see if I can share the presentation. Here we are. I would like to address three subjects, three points, and later give a place to the discussion. In the first place, I would like to offer a brief description of the program I'm in charge of. The program is, as I said, the doctoral program in social sciences of the University of Buenos Aires. It is a program that is governed by two principles that are many times difficult to match: the principles of democratic access and of quality standard and of excellence. The PhD program in social sciences of the University of Buenos Aires is a big program. It's the largest PhD program in Argentina, with more than 900 active students, more than 8 courses held by more than 150 professors. And it has, more than almost 1,000 graduates from our program, with a rate of completion which is high for our standards, 60% completion rate. And it has reached the highest qualification on our national evaluation system. But it's a strictly face-to-face program. So with the quarantine, we had to adapt this massive program to this migration to the virtual world. I wanted to describe a little bit about the pandemic in higher education in Argentina. We went into an early quarantine. We wanted to learn from the European experience, and as soon as in March 2020, it was our summer, we went into a very large and strict quarantine that took place from March 2020 up to August 2021. During that time, institutional facilities were closed, the schools were closed, restrictions in public transportations and access to commercial facilities were sustained. And there was an overall support of the measures, with protest and loss of legitimacy of the government, naturally. But the people could normally comply to the measures, with the measures of the quarantine. It has deepened an economic crisis that we have been dealing with for the past 4 years or so. But in that context, we had to migrate from a face-to-face program to a virtual program, not only in postgraduate studies, but also in higher studies, and in all the educational levels in Argentina went online. Our evaluations and lessons from this experience. I happen to have some figures from a survey addressed by a center of studies, Atenea Center of Studies, in 28 national universities across Argentina. And I wanted to share some notes on the evaluation of this experience. In the first place, the professors of the higher studies of the universities in Argentina have evaluated that the virtual platforms offered, in general, a good adaptability of content and dynamics that were held in face-to-face experiences. In social sciences, we had the same evaluation. Our professors evaluate that the contents that were being taught in face-to-face classrooms were easy to adapt to the virtual platforms, with not great loss of the quality of the contents being taught. We've also noticed a significant reduction of dropout, and also a significant number of previous PhD students were able to resume their studies, come back to the PhD, and defend their thesis. It's interesting. We thought that technology and connection was socially excluding of the least privileged people. But we happen to notice that we have learned that our cities and our transport is more excluding than technology. In the third place, we've noticed a clear deterioration of peer exchange. The exchange between professors and students have suffered some deterioration, but the most clear deterioration happened in the exchange between colleagues, between students. We have colleagues, scholars that came from Peru or Mexico or Germany and are living in studios 10 blocks away from the university. They haven't had the opportunity to step on a classroom, and they have been dealing with their PhD studies with no contact with peers. That is something that technology, I think, could help solve, but there's a limit for peer exchange in these virtual platforms that has been has implied a reduction of the quality of the experience of doctoral studies, and has also shrinked the institutional thickness, the institutional institutional thickness of our universities. And a last point I would like to note is things that have to do with health, with welfare, with the burnout of not only of the teaching teams, but also of the students, and the visual overload. And we happen to notice that the professors that provided audio materials, such as podcasts, had a more effective experience with less charge over the students, and with better results in the teaching experience. That's almost all I have prepared for today. Looking forward to hearing your interviews, and many thanks for the hospitality and the invitation and the organization of this session.
Thank you very much, Luciano, and thank you especially for joining us at short notice, but still some fascinating insights, I'm sure, everyone will agree. So we now come to the last part of our session, where we can have a panel discussion and a response to the some of the questions which we have received. Could I invite all our panelists to reappear on the screen, please? And don't forget your microphones, don't be like me. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with one of the questions that have come forward from the audience. I think, among other things, this picks up on which Maria so effectively called the time bomb of scholarships. So, and the question is, how do universities deal with delays in doctoral education because of the pandemic? The question goes on to ask about whether extensions can be asked for, under what conditions would they be accepted. So this is two things, I think, here. There's the academic extension, and then probably more important for the candidate, the financial support extension. So any comments here, please?
Maybe I could start.
You want to start? Yeah.
So I guess there's an important point here. I think it is about the way the project needs to be adjusted. I think that many students obviously are very passionate about the work that they're planning. We certainly at UQ, at University of Queensland, we've certainly taken the view that it's very important to reconfigure, we call rescoping the project, that they had to really think carefully about that. So, for example, a person who's planning to go overseas internationally to do some field work is simply not possible with the borders being closed. And so I think that what people have done quite creatively is to access new data sets, to be able to do things virtually and be able to rescope their PhD project. And so we do at UQ, we work within a 4-year time frame in terms of funding, and so we only pay usually for 3.5 years of scholarship. We did give people an extension, but they had to demonstrate that they had actually made a big effort to rescope that project and then demonstrate why they needed more time. So I think that holding on to the project as it was formed pre-COVID is not realistic, and so we have to work with them to do that. And it's really important for the advisors to work with them as well. So our answer really was to say, demonstrate that you made a big effort to address these changes, and if so, then we'll support you to be extended. So it's trying to encourage them to think more flexibly in that context.
Thanks, Alistair. Any other views on this?
Yeah, I mean, in Africa, it's very much the same. It's been done on a case-by-case basis. So the onus is on the student to show that he or she has made considerable effort and has been held back by the situation of the pandemic. And once that is shown, universities have been a lot more flexible in granting extensions than they used to be before. I haven't seen any evidence of more money being made available to students. I haven't seen much of that. I haven't seen any of that. But time has been added and made it easier for them to get that. And I've seen also a good number of people that have switched from using primary data for their work to using secondary data, where it's available and possible. So those kinds of things have been encouraged by many universities in order to make it possible for students to graduate.
Thank you. I mean, could I throw in a supplementary question here for everyone? I mean, do you think that there will be a COVID generation of doctoral graduates who are carrying some sort of handicap for the next 5 to 10 years or beyond in their careers, or will we just leave it all behind us? Any views on that?
We can't really be certain, but I think we'll just have to be prepared, to be able to help our students in the Philippines. As you know, it's not just COVID, it's also natural disasters. So I think we really have to, the mantra we have is to be reasonable and compassionate. And I think we really have to address that, and supervisors are crucial here in helping students deal with this, not just now, but in the future as well.
I think in some sectors there may be some challenges. Certainly in parts of in some areas of science where high quality publications are seen as the currency of advancement of students. I think there's a feeling that inability of perhaps of doctoral candidates to actually produce those outputs may hold them back in terms of their careers. And I think that's probably in some ways the wrong way to develop a career, but it's a reality for them. And perhaps that's something we need to think about as a sector, I think, in terms of those things. So we hear a lot from the biomedical and bioscience areas about how that's potentially holding back their students, why they need more time, and that they're being disadvantaged. So I think that's a group who may argue that they're being disadvantaged, but it's more about the way that they're operating, in my view, and that's something that needs to be discussed, I think.
Look, in response to your question, I've heard students in Ghana refer to themselves as COVID graduates, largely meaning that they did graduate from the university with a lot of difficulty, and that even though they didn't have the optimal conditions that they had hoped for, they were still able to graduate. And they say it with a lot of pride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's surely a sign of resilience that they can come through. Absolutely. The mitigations, of course, are up to us, not up to them. We have to take account of this in progression and employment decisions. So let me return to the list we have here. There's a question inevitably about digitalization. We've heard a lot about that in the presentations, and especially about digital divide. This question seems to focus more on how digitalization facilitates working with diasporas, particularly for developing and emerging countries. So is that something that's been brought forward by the pandemic, or is it a trend that was happening anyway?
I think it was a trend that was beginning to happen. As I said in my presentation, it varied from place to place. In many African universities, they had begun the process of pursuing distance education, and therefore were putting in place the infrastructure required for that. What the pandemic did was put pressure on them to accelerate the process. So those universities that had begun had put in place the laboratories that would allow that, had the platforms that facilitated that. They still had an advantage and moved much faster. It also meant that they could bring in some of the nationals working in the US, working in Europe and the UK and so on, to be able to offer programs. So collaboration was made a lot easier as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, while you're on, Ernest, there's a specific question for you about are there funders of capacity building programs from abroad who have prolonged the financing of their programs with and without cost extension. And the example is given of CDE in Sweden. So I know you said the opposite about the ODA cuts, but
I haven't seen any evidence of actual extensions of funding being done. What I know is that many of the donors have expressed an interest in re-engaging. So in our engagement with UKRI, for example, we've had recent discussions about looking at doctoral funding as a long-term thing and not something that you do for 3 or 4 years only. So I think what's going to happen as a result of the pandemic is that most donors are going to look at, are going to have a longer-term view, so that if there's something like the pandemic coming up, it becomes only a blip in that long-term scenario. So I think things are going to change probably sooner rather than later.
Thank you. It's not in the list, but in a way, picking up on that previous topic, I mean, we have heard quite a lot about the digital divide. I mean, there's two aspects, I suppose: the divide between countries, but also the divide within countries. We know that for some people, remote working is much more difficult than for others. So again, I mean, do you have any comments about the fairness of this and anything we can do about that?
I might comment that we noticed that it's there is a very clear difference between the digital access to the universities for those who are taking graduate studies and postgraduate studies, and for those who are in their initial steps of higher education. That is quite clear. And even in those cases, we happen to notice that a city, and once again, I will state the same thing, a city is more excluding in terms of transportation and access to the buildings, to the university facilities, the internet connection. That was something surprising for us. I had been teaching in postgraduate and graduate, and in initial courses in higher education, and I happened to notice that people that wouldn't have been able to access to the buildings because they happen to have large work journeys, could access through internet in difficult conditions, but could access through internet to the courses. The government has generated a policy that allows to download contents from .edu URLs without cost, and there are many students from popular neighborhoods that have been able to pursue university studies that in the pre-pandemic world wouldn't have been able to do so. There was a prejudice concerning accessibility to internet and devices and communication devices that we had, that they were going to be more excluding than the physical face-to-face experience of the university, and that didn't happen to be the case. That is something surprising for us.
That's very interesting. Somebody's also picked up, Luciano, on the point you made about podcasts, which I found very interesting. Mm-hmm. It says quite a lot about the pedagogy, psychology of learning. Do you think that's something that you'll carry forward in the future?
Well, actually, there have been students that work cleaning institutional facilities and houses and listen to the classes through podcasts while working. or while taking public transportation. Videos and synchronic activities happen to be more difficult to pursue, not only in terms of internet connection, but also in terms of the visual attention they require. And with podcasts, we happen to find better results with audio materials that only require the audio attention happen to be more effective. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We are shortly going to run out of time, so I think if people have individual questions for panelists, please just use the facility to ask them directly. I'd like to finish with a question for all of the panel. I mean, if there was one thing about the pandemic experience that you would definitely want to keep for the future, what would that be?
I think it's the use of the internet, I think, is very important. But although here in the Philippines, it's a very challenging experience. There are lots of people who are digital natives in a sense, but it's the lack of connectivity in some parts of the country. Because I don't think we're going to go back to a full on-site anymore. I mean, there's no going back to that. There's always going to be the major contribution of internet will always be there. But how to deal with it is another matter. You know, how to control it so that it will not control the education system is something that's important for us to consider.
Mm-hmm.
I think the pandemic has shown us the need to work together. My experience of the last 1.5 years in Africa has been what I call the urgency that the universities attach to collaboration. And in doing so, I've seen them exchange things virtually much more frequently than was the case before. I've seen a greater eagerness to partner in looking for funding from the region. I've seen a new urgency about working with African governments. So I think the pandemic has opened everybody's eyes to the need to work together. African governments now pay a lot more attention to research being done in the universities, in the belief that the context matters, that they can no longer outsource from outside the solutions to their development challenges.
That would really be quite a seismic change if it does hold. Very interesting.
Maybe I can just add one thing, and it's a slightly different thing. I think what the pandemic really brought to our attention was how uneven support for doctoral candidates is within our institution. But this is at my own institution, and I think one of the things that we've looked at is how do we get a more even support and not leave it to, I guess, the vagaries of research groups or to individual departments.
Mm.
So that's something we're working on. It's something that actually came to the fore, and I think it's one of the benefits is that we've adopted a much more whole of institution approach to supporting doctoral education.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important for the candidates.
I could add a very simple thing, the economy in the use of time. We tend to arrange meetings that for one single subject would prolong for 2 hours or so. And now we can arrange meetings 15 minutes or 20-minute meetings in which we go straight to the topic, we solve it, and we pass to the next thing. I think that economy in the use of time is something that in face-to-face meetings is more difficult, and I believe we will keep on having this kind of meetings in the virtual world in a post-pandemic scenario anyway.
That's great. So we have reached the end of our allotted time. So can I ask our audience, I mean, they can't clap, but please join me in thanking you for your extremely insightful comments. And I do think that we have fulfilled the promise of being enriched by this global comparison of experiences, seeing the many commonalities, but also understanding that some of the stresses of the pandemic are falling unevenly in different ways in different places as well. So can I thank you all. To the audience, we now have a break in the conference. So if you leave this room, we hope we'll see you in just under 20 minutes in the next plenary session. So we'll call this one closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.